The airplane cabin buzzed with a low hum, engines steady beneath the quiet murmur of passengers lost in their own thoughts. Somewhere near the middle row, a young boy laughed, a sound so light, so unburdened, it should have melted the monotony of travel. Yet it did not. For one man, seated stiffly across the aisle, that laughter carried not joy but provocation. His gaze sharpened each time the sound rose, his jaw tightening with the bitterness of someone who had never learned to share space with dignity. Around him, passengers noticed the shift. Eyes darted, then fell away. Silence became complicity, the kind of silence that has followed injustice for centuries. The man's entitlement spread through the air like smoke. His body leaned forward. With a sharp edge, his voice finally breaking through. "Quiet that boy." It was not a request. It was a command, born of the authority he had always assumed was his. The mother's hands froze where they rested on her son's shoulder. She did not answer. Her silence was not agreement, but a defense she had been forced to perfect, measured, cautious, weary from too many battles that ended the same way. The boy's laughter stumbled, falling into uncertainty, confusion flickering in his wide eyes. Across the aisle, a stranger lowered his newspaper. He said nothing, yet his presence, his stillness, marked a shift. The cabin's air seemed to grow, heavier, as though everyone waited for a storm they could already feel but dared not name. The man tapped impatiently against the armrest, eyes locked on the child, his arrogance swelling in the silence. And in that moment, the cabin itself seemed to hold its breath, bracing for what would come next. The cabin's silence stretched, the air dense with something unseen yet undeniable. The man leaned back, but his posture did not relax. His shoulders sat rigid, chest rising with slow, shallow breaths that carried more menace than calm. His smirk lingered, crooked, unbothered, a performance of control. For him, discomfort was not his to carry. It was to be placed on others, as it always had been. He glanced at the mother, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "You people never learn. Keep him quiet." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She did not rise to his bait. That restraint was survival, but he mistook it for weakness. His fingers drummed against the armrest, the rhythm impatient, entitled, as if the very space around him owed him submission. The boy shifted closer to his mother, whispering, "Did I do something wrong?" Her hand tightened around his, a silent reassurance. But the words stung her chest. How a child could already question his right to joy. She wanted to tell him the truth. No, it wasn't him. It was the world that broke around people like this man, and the silence of those who sat watching. The stranger across the aisle finally spoke, his voice calm, unshaken. "He's just a child." The man turned, eyes narrowing, the smirk faltering for the first time. A beat of silence followed, heavy, waiting. He adjusted in his seat, clearing his throat as though to reclaim dominance. But his breathing betrayed him, louder now, uneven. The entitlement he wore so confidently began to show its cracks. The quiet around him was no longer compliance, it was judgment. And though he sat rigid, it was the kind of stiffness that belongs to someone slowly unraveling. The rhythm of his drumming hand stopped. Then, with a suddenness that stole the breath from the cabin, his palm cut through the air. The sound cracked loud, unnatural against the steady hum of the engines. The boy's head jerked sideways, his small frame stiffening with shock. The mother froze, her body recoiling, eyes wide, but voice trapped in her throat. A trembling hand reached for her son, her instinct louder than her fear. She whispered, almost broken, "Baby, look at me." Gasps scattered like sparks among the passengers. A woman in the back covered her mouth. A man 2 rows ahead shifted forward, but stopped himself, his knuckles white around the seat. The silence wasn't calm anymore. It was paralyzed disbelief. The boy blinked, lips parted, but no sound came. His cheek reddened under the mark of a stranger's rage. His gaze drifted to his mother's eyes, searching, pleading, as though she could explain what could never be explained. The man sat back, his chest rising, eyes daring anyone to speak. "That's how you teach respect," he muttered, each word heavy, unapologetic. The stranger across the aisle leaned forward now, no hesitation in his voice. "You crossed a line," he said, steady, deliberate. The cabin felt like a courtroom. Every stare turned judge, every breath a witness statement. The mother's silence grew louder, her arm wrapping around her son, her presence becoming a shield. She didn't need to shout. The truth already hung in the air, and for the first time, the man's rigid posture didn't look like strength. It looked like a fortress about to collapse, built on noise but cracking under silence. The boy's lips quivered before the sound slipped out, fragile, barely audible, but piercing enough to fracture the air. "Mom?" His voice trembled, not loud, not demanding, yet heavier than any shout. It was a question, a plea and a wound all at once. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, time stilled. She wanted to answer, to gather him into the safety of words, but her throat closed around centuries of silence. Her gaze burned with both love and helplessness, carrying the weight of every mother who had held back screams to protect a child from a world that punished their existence. The man smirked again, though weaker now, as though daring her to respond. "Control your boy," he said under his breath, dismissive, almost casual. Her hand trembled as it stroked her son's cheek, the red mark still fresh. No words came. Only a look, one that told him without saying, "You are not wrong. You are not broken. You are mine, and I see you." Across the aisle, the stranger leaned in closer. "You hear that?" His voice was steady, but quiet enough to sting. "A child whispers, and it's louder than you'll ever be." The cabin shifted. Passengers straightened, some meeting her eyes for the first time. The silence that once obeyed fear now felt like an unseen chorus, standing with her in their restraint. The man's jaw tightened, his fist curling again, but his breath faltered. For the first time, his presence no longer filled the space. It shrank beneath the weight of a whisper, beneath the quiet dignity that refused to break into noise. In that pause, power changed hands, without shouting, without force. Just a whisper. The man's smirk wavered, but before it could return, a new presence filled the cabin. A chair scraped softly, almost unnoticed at first, but enough to draw eyes. He stood, not in anger, not in rush, but with a calm steadiness that unsettled more than rage ever could. The stranger didn't speak. His silence carried a weight that pulled every gaze toward him. His shoulders squared, his eyes fixed not on the mother or the child, but directly on the man who had struck. No threats, no shouting. Just a stare that pierced the arrogance still clinging to the aggressor's posture. Passengers shifted in their seats, phones half lifted, breaths caught in their throats. The mother held her son closer, her lips trembling but silent. The child blinked through tears, watching, as though trying to understand what strength could look like without fists or noise. Finally, the man scoffed, trying to regain ground. "What? You gonna lecture me too?" His voice cracked where it should have been firm. The stranger tilted his head slightly, his voice low but clear. "No, I'm just standing where you thought no one would." The line hit harder than the slap itself. The cabin grew colder, the power dynamic bending in quiet, irreversible shifts. The aggressor's jaw clenched, his knuckles whitening. But the laughter that once filled his arrogance was gone. The silence was no longer fearful. It was expectant. It belonged not to him, but to the stranger who had claimed it with nothing more than presence. For the first time, the racist man was the one shrinking in his own seat, and everyone knew this moment would not vanish with the landing. The stranger's calm gaze lingered, but behind the silence came the echoes of a life where silence had always been weaponized. In the oppressor's mind, flashes surfaced like shards of glass he could no longer bury. A classroom decades ago, his voice mocking a boy's skin, his words sharp, cruel. The teacher adjusted her glasses, heard it, and chose to smile instead of intervene. The laughter of classmates wrapped around him like applause. No punishment, no correction, just permission. Years later at work, the same cruelty sharpened into quieter cuts. A coworker complained once, whispering, "He called me that word." The supervisor, tired and dismissive, sighed. "Let's not make this bigger than it is." The complaint was buried under paperwork that never left the drawer. The man walked away smirking, shielded again by silence that was supposed to protect the vulnerable, but instead armored him. Now, back in the cabin, the echoes blended with the present. The mother's trembling hands, the boy's whisper, the weight of every eye staring, it all pressed against. The stranger's words still lingered when another sound rose, not loud but fragile, almost breaking. It wasn't from the present. It was memory, woven into the tension that filled the air. A trembling voice whispered from the past, "No one will believe me." Those words had once belonged to a child, then to a teenager, then to an adult who stopped trying. They were never answers, never confessions, just warnings, passed down like an heirloom of silence. Each time someone spoke, the system swallowed their pain. Each time they begged for justice, the room looked away. And each time, the oppressor grew stronger, wearing arrogance like a badge that rules could not touch. The man on the plane shifted, the flashbacks clawing at him. He had heard those voices before, muttered in corners, broken in washrooms, left unheard in offices. He had counted on their silence, counted on their disbelief. The mother's voice, now steady though quiet, cut through. "Do you know what it's like, telling your truth and being laughed at?" She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Her boy's tear-streaked face leaned into her arm, small shoulders carrying centuries of dismissal. The man's smirk cracked again. His jaw twitched, searching for defense. None came. The silence of the passengers was not the silence he knew, the one that once shielded him. This was a silence of reckoning, heavy and deliberate, each stare holding the weight of voices once ignored. The stranger leaned slightly closer, his words soft, certain. "They'll believe her. They'll believe him. Times change. Even if you don't." The man looked down. For the first time, he seemed smaller than the seat that held him, and the haunting whisper, "No one will believe me," finally began to lose its power. The boy's sobs had quieted into the hollow rhythm of exhaustion. His mother's hand stayed on his back, steady and firm, though her own fingers trembled. The racist man's eyes darted from seat to seat, searching for someone, anyone, to nod in his defense. None came. The stranger remained standing. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His silence was the sharpest voice in the room. Eyes locked on the man, steady, unblinking, unyielding. It was not anger that filled the space, but something heavier, harder to escape. A verdict already delivered without a sentence spoken. The racist shifted, muttering, "This is ridiculous. I didn't..." His words stumbled, breaking against the wall of silence pressing down on him. No one answered. Not even the child he struck. Especially not the stranger. The mother whispered, almost to herself, "This is how it always is, until someone refuses to look away." The stranger's stillness carried that refusal. His presence turned every passenger into a witness, every silence into judgment. The cabin seemed smaller now, the air heavier, as if the weight of years of dismissal and laughter at cruelty had finally found no escape. The man's arrogance cracked again, his shoulders slumped, his lips tightening into something that resembled defeat. He tried to look away, but the stranger's silence followed, demanding he stay where he was, stripped of his shield. A passenger in the back coughed, but no one broke the spell. For once, the silence did not belong to the oppressed. It belonged to justice, quiet and unshakable. The stranger still hadn't spoken a word, yet everyone knew. The verdict had already been read. The racist man's chest rose and fell too fast now, his once loud voice shrinking into nervous fragments. The stranger still hadn't spoken, yet the silence pressed him harder than any fist. He tried to clear his throat, forcing steadiness. This has gone too far, he muttered, though his words held no anchor. The flight attendant stepped forward, her clipboard trembling in her hand. "Sir, please sit down." Her voice broke midway, but she didn't step back. It was the kind of plea that carried authority not in volume, but in exhaustion. Everyone heard the fear woven into her tone, fear not of him, but of the history he represented. The mother's whisper slid into the air like a prayer breaking loose. "Not again. Not my son." She clutched the boy's small hand tighter, her eyes refusing to look away this time. The weight of her voice made even the hum of the engines feel like silence. The man shifted, his fingers drumming against the armrest, searching for control that was no longer his. His face flushed, his gaze darted toward the passengers, but they gave him nothing, not pity, not approval, just watching, waiting. Someone coughed, another shook their head. Small gestures, but they deepened the crack in his armor. The stranger's stillness was a mirror, forcing him to see himself without excuse, without cover. He barked, suddenly louder, "You don't know what it's like!" Then stopped, realizing how empty it sounded, how little ground was left beneath him. His voice collapsed back into fragments. The cabin was no longer his stage. He stood, trembling in the eyes of those who would not look away, his defenses folding beneath the quiet verdict surrounding him. The man's voice had collapsed into fragments, yet the weight of the moment only grew heavier. A rustle passed through the cabin, subtle at first, then louder in its silence. One by one, passengers raised their phones, the glow of screens catching his trembling face. He noticed. His hand froze mid-gesture, then dropped to his side. "You, stop! Recording me!" he demanded, his tone cracking, more plea than command. But no one stopped. The cameras did not flinch. Neither did the stranger still standing before him. A boy whispered, "They're all watching." His mother squeezed his hand tighter, her voice steady this time. "Let them." That simple answer rippled further than any shout could. Whispers spread across rows, passengers leaning toward each other. No single word was clear, but together it sounded like a verdict, an unbroken chain of witness. Every lens pointed at him turned arrogance into evidence, silence into judgment. The man's face drained. He shook his head as if to deny what was happening, but there was no undoing this. He was no longer the aggressor commanding attention. He was the one on trial, trapped in the eyes and recordings of strangers who refused to look away. The boy lowered his gaze, breathing unevenly. The mother held him close, her silence no longer helpless but defiant. She didn't need to argue, didn't need to shout. The world was finally listening without her saying another word. The stranger, still silent, shifted just enough to close the space between himself and the man. He didn't touch him, didn't speak. He only stood. And that standing, multiplied through every recording phone, became larger than the plane itself. The weight of the cabin pressed down like judgment itself. Phones stayed lifted. But now, it wasn't only silence carrying the scene, it was the voice that finally broke it. Calm. Steady. "You thought no one would stand up," the stranger said, his tone measured, unshaken. "Not today." The words weren't shouted, but they landed sharper than any yell could. The man flinched, his shoulders tightening as if the very air had turned against him. He tried to speak, to reclaim some fragment of control, but his throat caught. All that came was a dry, bitter cough. "Don't twist this," he muttered, eyes darting toward the passengers. He was loud, disrespectful. His excuses cracked the moment they left his lips. No one nodded. No one agreed. The mother's voice, quiet but certain, slid into the space. "My son was a child. That's all he was." Her son clung to her sleeve, eyes still wet but steady now. The stranger didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His stillness was force enough. Passengers whispered, some shaking their heads. A man across the aisle muttered, "I saw everything." Another woman added, "We all did." The racist man's chest rose faster, each breath heavier, his certainty collapsing into sweat and fear. He shifted in his seat as though trying to shrink from their eyes, but the eyes did not look away. The stranger lowered his voice once more, almost a whisper, but everyone heard it. "Your power ends where witnesses begin." No one applauded. No one cheered. The silence afterward was heavier than noise, a silence that stripped arrogance and left truth bare. And in that silence, a verdict had already been delivered. The air felt different now, heavier, as though the cabin itself had turned into a courtroom. No judge sat at the front, no wooden bench marked the law. Yet everything about the silence screamed judgment. The passengers' eyes became witnesses, their phones the jury, and the weight pressing on the racist man's chest was the gavel already fallen. He tried again to defend himself, his voice cracking. You don't understand. Things like this get twisted. I didn't mean—" "No one needs to twist it," a woman said firmly from across the aisle. "We saw you." Her words didn't rise above calm, but they carried the sting of truth. He shifted, pulling at his collar, sweat darkening his shirt. His arrogance, once sharp, faltered into something pitiful. The child's eyes, wide yet unbroken, caught him. That look, silent, wounded yet steady, was more damning than any testimony. The man looked away quickly, but the gaze lingered in his mind, flashing like a mirror of what he had become. The stranger's voice came low again. "Every excuse sounds smaller here, doesn't it?" The courtroom inside the cabin had spoken, and its verdict was written in silence, carved deeper than law itself. The man's shoulders shook, his hands trembling as though the weight of every eye in the cabin pressed him into the seat. His breath came shallow, uneven, but no one moved to comfort him. No one reached for excuses. The silence held. The mother adjusted her child closer, shielding the small frame with her arm. She didn't shout, didn't curse. Her eyes stayed fixed on the man, but her lips remained closed. That silence struck harder than any scream could. The man whispered almost to himself, This isn't who I am." The child's soft voice carried over the hush. "Mama, is he sorry?" The mother only squeezed his hand, not answering. Her silence was the answer. A crew member stepped in, firm yet calm. "Sir, you'll need to stay seated. Authorities will meet you at landing." The words landed heavy. The man swallowed, nodding faintly, the arrogance gone, replaced by a hollow stare. Phones glowed across the cabin. Dozens of small screens pointed in his direction, capturing every twitch, every drop of sweat. He turned his face away, but the cameras did not. Narration lingered quietly in the air. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes in whispers, through a mother's silence, a child's question, and a crowd refusing to look away. Hours later, the footage left the cabin. It traveled faster than flight itself, posted, shared, repeated. Millions watched a man collapse, not under fists, but under the weight of his own cruelty exposed. He sat trembling, realizing the truth too late. Power built on fear cannot survive silence. And this time, silence became the loudest sound in the world. He sat alone in the dim room, phone glowing against his trembling fingers. Photo after photo slid across the screen, smiles at company dinners, firm handshakes, the face of a man certain of his place in the world. Now each picture felt like it belonged to a stranger. A message popped up. One line. "Please stop contacting us." It was from his oldest friend. His thumb hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't reply. What could he say? The silence outside was worse. Neighbors passed his porch, eyes darting away. Their children, once laughing at his jokes, now crossed the street without a word. His world shrank to the walls of the house and the steady hum of a refrigerator. He whispered to no one, "I didn't mean for it to... I'm not..." The words broke in his throat. No answer came. His daughter's photo blinked on the screen. She hadn't called in weeks. He dialed once, then hung up before the ring. Fear of hearing her silence was heavier than silence itself. Narration pressed like a weight. This was not peace. This was exile. Not the loud downfall of scandal, but the slow, relentless erosion of relevance. The man leaned back, pressing his palms against his face. For the first time, he felt how silence could bury louder than noise, how absence could condemn sharper than judgment. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a car door slammed. Life went on, but not for him. The storm had passed, yet its silence was heavier than thunder, unyielding, permanent, and his alone to carry. Days later, his name was still unknown. Clips flooded every screen. Arguments erupted in living rooms, yet the man who had stood in silence had already walked away. Why won't he speak? A reporter pressed, shoving a microphone toward an empty doorway. No answer came. At a diner, two strangers whispered over coffee. "He didn't even raise his voice," one said. "And still, he broke him," the other replied. Their silence stretched longer than their words. Back in the cabin of memory, the faces of passengers lingered. Not the slap, not the trembling oppressor, but the stranger's steady calm, a strength unspoken, carried without performance. A coworker asked him once, days after the storm, "You're the guy in that video, aren't you?" He looked down, stirred his coffee, and only said, "I was just there." Then he left. No smile, no correction, no hunger for recognition. Narration cut in softly. Some heroes are not built for spotlights. Their power lives in the echoes, not the applause. Online, debates grew fierce. Was it enough? Did silence count as resistance? Did calmness count as protest? Yet in living rooms, in classrooms, in hearts that had carried fear too long, his image lived quietly. Proof that dignity didn't need a microphone. He walked home one evening, the world buzzing behind him. A child passed by, tugged his mother's hand and whispered, "That's him." The mother smiled faintly, but he kept walking, shoulders low, face turned away from recognition. Justice didn't ask him to shine. It asked him to endure, and he chose the shadows, leaving the world to wrestle with its reflection while he carried only silence, his and theirs. The boy's question hung in the air. His mother squeezed his hand tighter, her lips trembling before she whispered, "Not over, but not the same." Her voice shook, yet in it there was a fragile thread of hope. At a neighborhood store, two women murmured near the counter. "That video," one said. "It won't change the world overnight," the other replied. "But it's harder to deny now." They exchanged a glance, heavy with both weariness and quiet belief. In classrooms, teachers paused lessons to replay the clip. Students stared, some with shame, others with courage, as the image of a calm stranger holding back violence became more than a story. It became a mirror. Narration slipped in. Change rarely marches with drums. It slips in through whispers, spreading in kitchens, bus stops, and late-night conversations, refusing to be buried. Meanwhile, the oppressor remained caged